Welcome back to the second to last week of our class. So we're almost there. We're almost going to make it. We're going to cover a lot this week, and most of what we talk about is just honestly not delved into that deeply in Null, which is okay. You know, the more you get closer to your own time frame, the harder it is to kind of pick out what to talk about, and that's the true historical dilemma that we have. So here's just an overview. All the topics we're going to cover today. It's going to pack a punch. I mean, there's a lot in here, and I'm just going to give really the history behind sort of all of these and the church's response to them. And the reason why I'm kind of just throwing all of this out there is because we're still kind of wrestling with all of the implications of this today. And I think it's fair to say that knowing the history of where these come from and kind of the recent developments, they help us see our own presuppositions and how we approach the faith, how we approach church. And they can help a lot of people understand that we share it with. So that's part of the goal in this week especially, is to see kind of the state of the church in recent years. So the Second Vatican Council of the RCC, Roman Catholic Church. Just a quick note, you don't need to remember these dates. I'm just putting them before you right now so that you can kind of see when this is going on. This is going on, I mean, about 60 years ago, but most of it actually takes place in 1965. These are just kind of the prefatory years that they decided what they were going to decide in the last year. If I had to summarize this in all of it, it's when the Roman Catholic Church, along with Vatican I, but especially in Vatican II, when they opened the doors and let the fresh air in. Now, I did not come up with that phrase. I was actually Catholic who came up with that phrase. But it's when the Roman Catholic Church sort of allowed their approach to culture, to Mass, to church, and many things, not necessarily doctrinally change, but in their approach and their practice, it did change. So Pope John the 23rd, he calls this meeting, and he used the word, of course he's using it in Italian and Latin, that they're going to update their church and their methods. So the church has been growing largely ecumenical. This really is true, especially after the World Wars. You know, it's not just an American phenomenon that after World War II, Protestants and Catholics were beginning to get along much more better, but actually worldwide, when you had sort of a common enemy, you had a common, shall we say, good side, ally side, facing an obvious evil of the Nazi Party, and that gave some sense, and I think it's fair to say that many churches following that increased in what we would call the ecumenical world, or their ability to reach out to other denominations and work well together. And so that began to happen, especially after World War II. And I really think that part of what's going on here is still the implications of World War II and the aftermath of all that's going on there. One word you may not be familiar with on the second point, Christendom, or what we might call the Holy Roman Empire. One of the interesting things is it's really easy to see, in some ways, when Christendom began, when the Holy Roman Empire began, kind of as a dominant power in the world, you know, especially around Gregory the Great and 600, and you can historically find a lot of data about that. Point being, it's easier to determine when it started than when it ended. One recent argument that I think is fairly persuasive is that Christendom really ended after the World Wars, that the Roman power sort of lost their dominance and their ability to have a presence in the world at that point. And so part of what's going on in the Second Vatican Council is actually reorganization. Because they're now facing a world that is allowing Catholicism to thrive in places that isn't under the direct rule of Rome, and in some ways. And that's part of what's going on in this Vatican Council. Now, for them, they'll call it the Vatican Council, but for them, this is what they would also call an ecumenical council. Not in this sense of the word ecumenical, but in them, it's sort of an official church dogmas that are established at these ecumenical councils. So they would call Nicaea and Constantinople, the earlier creeds, they would call those the first and second ecumenical councils. Now, one of the massive changes, and this is why you see this in America today, is that Mass, so what they call church service, they were all celebrated in Latin before, but post-Vatican II, Masses were celebrated in the home language of where it was. At least they were allowed to. Many of them continued to be in Latin, but they were allowed, for example, to be in English, which you just did not find before Vatican II. And actually, most recently, only a few months ago, the Pope, current Pope, did not kind of banned a lot of the Latin practices so that people would hear it in their own language. And it's still, the implications of this are still unfolding to this day. But what this allowed is for people to enter a Catholic church and to hear what was going on. That's a shift, and that gains, I think it's fair to say, some trust from outsiders who can go in and hear it without having to know Latin. Now, all of the documents that they produced officially were published in Latin, and that still goes on today. And it's sort of an untrue myth that in the Vatican you can go and you can just speak Latin and people understand you. That was true more so around this time, but nowadays it's quite rare to find someone who can speak Latin, even though some of them are still educated to do so. Now, this is where the rubber meets the road. They became more open to Protestants. This is where Catholics officially made the declaration that salvation could be found outside of the Roman Catholic Church, though not outside of Christ. So that became their kind of official doctrine, and it allowed Catholics to be able to call Protestants, even though some of them were before, their brothers. And that's why today you can go to a Catholic church, and even though you're a Protestant, at least officially they can call you their brother in Christ and even accept your baptism. All right, so just threw this in here because I thought it was quite fascinating. You'll never guess who that is. That's the Pope. In Vatican II, it was really common for the cardinals. So the cardinals are the people that hold the highest authority outside of the Pope, to sort of debate these things and discuss them. And most of the actual discussion took place in meetings outside of this room, but this is kind of where these things were officially sanctioned in 1965. So I just thought I'd share that. Okay, shifting on. Part of this is going to just very briefly repeat something I have mentioned before, but I want to kind of push it further into the modern era, and I want to get very specific about the implications of what this means for us today and the current state of the church. So David Friedrich Strauss, so he's early 19th century into the middle, and he's credited, and it's a rough estimate to say who started this and who didn't, but he's credited with starting the quest for the historical Jesus, meaning the approach to finding Jesus as it actually happened. Now, this second phrase is really what I'm wanting you to grab from this. He's wanting to investigate all of this, all of the scriptures, all of the historical documents of Jesus in an unbiased way. He thought that the best history, the best scholarship in around Jesus is someone who does not approach it already assuming it's true and so forth. So he thinks it's best to approach these documents in an unbiased way. You'll still find those phrases. Most of it is stemming from him and some of the other guys I've mentioned before. And he popularized reading the scriptures as documents that should be historically critiqued. That kind of opens up the door for what we're going to look at next. Okay, so this continues on. I'm going to go through these points kind of quickly because I'm going to talk about the implications more than just these historical bullet points. So these are kind of just the major signposts of what's happened in the last century. So after 1906, big shifts in the historical Jesus, mostly because it just lost popularity from Albert Schweitzer. But in 1953, and this is where it starts becoming very relevant for us today, at least visibly relevant, is Ernest Caseman's The Second Quest, approaching the Gospels as containing some historical data that needs to be extracted. In other words, let's approach the Gospels, let's approach Acts, and let's find the historical bits in there that are good. Let's take those out and let's kind of throw out everything else as just later additions. So Rudolf Bultmann, kind of a huge influence on this. And they're basically trying to find out what part of the Bible is actually worth keeping. What part of it is historical. And that's what they're seeking to find. E.P. Sanders, we'll tie this together in a moment, so bear with me. You don't have to remember these. I'm just trying to give you the big picture of what's going on. He's beginning what people would call the third quest. He's largely asking the question, how did Paul and Jesus interact with their social context? So after the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in Egypt, basically the discovery of those opened up, or not Egypt, excuse me, that's Nag Hammadi, but after the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, people began to ask the question, okay, since 4Q 474 talks about this Davidic Messiah, and he uses the similar language as Paul does that mean Paul is using this social structure to answer questions that are unique to his time? And how does that impact the language of the kingdom of God that's promised in 1Q 174? And those are kind of the questions that Sanders asks, and those are just two that he mentions. He published a book, probably the most important book of the last 50 years in Jesus studies, Paul and Palestinian Judaism. Very cheap book you can pick up, but it's by far you won't be able to see how it's impacted people, quite frankly, until you read it. But that's by far the most important book, at least in terms of influence. So this last one, it's so strange what began to happen. So Jesus seminars emerged. So what happened was, in these Jesus seminars, scholars and lay people and ministers got together, went through the Gospels, and literally voted on, verse by verse, phrase by phrase, what passages were true and historically sound, and what were kind of fake and too miraculous to be true. So they had a bead system, and I'm going to show you a picture of these beads. So these are the beads. If you really thought Jesus said it, you held up a red bead. Red bead, Jesus said it. So if he's talking about something about loving your neighbor or so forth, nothing that's miraculous, nothing at all that has to do with him being the Son of God and sharing the glory of the Father, that's not historical for them. So they would never give it a red bead. They gave it a pink bead if he probably said it, if it was probably true. They weren't quite sure. They gave it a gray bead, so these gray beads, if it seems unlikely to be true, and then a black bead. Those were the things that they just knew weren't true. Jesus didn't really walk on water. Jesus didn't really feed the 5,000 men, women, and children. No, all those signs, he didn't actually rise from the dead. These are the things that we can just kind of give it a black bead and not really have to see it as authentically Christian. These pursued in the 80s and 90s. Really the only prominent guy who's still publishing from a lot of these is John Dominic Crossan, and kind of approaching Christianity in this some of it's true, but we can throw out the bits that we don't like kind of way. However you feel. I just find this so funny that people could hold up beads to judge which passages of Scripture they were going to hold on to. But that's what was going on. And these beads can still be found. I've looked into buying them just for fun's sake because I'm weird like that. And they're quite expensive. Okay, so this is where I think you might be most interested. This is where it matters what we've just looked at. So, implications of all of this. Skepticism of biblical authenticity is a fairly modern phenomenon. What I mean to say is, when you read accounts of miracles or when you read accounts of things happening in Scripture, and you share them with others, and sort of the presupposition is to be skeptical if it actually happened, is a very modern approach to the text. You know, in all of the earliest documents of the first few centuries, immediately following the death and life of Jesus, no one, not even the non-believers, challenged the fact that Jesus performed miraculous healings. No one challenged that. No one challenged that Jesus actually said some of the things that he said. Now, people kind of added, and they can do that, but whenever you take up a text and say, okay, is it true that Jesus actually walked on water? Well, to sort of take that as the most important thing is a very modern skepticism of, well, I have to be, what I'm trying to find when I read the Scriptures is what actually happened. And that approach, telling you, is stemming from modern scholarship, and particularly modern secular scholarship. All right, and that leads us into this point. Probably the most important thing, that at least the biggest thing that I hope you walk away from this slide, is that the historical critical method of Bible study becomes increasingly popular. So kind of defending the historicity of the Bible and defending kind of what text actually happened and so forth. And so to read the Scriptures is to understand of what happened, what was said, what it meant to the original readers. And it can actually, in a dangerous way, please hear me here, it can become a dangerous thing when you make the goal of reading Scripture or studying it simply to know what the author said or meant. That is not the goal of reading Scripture. And so that's why I add this kind of caveat that often at the cost of thinking, knowing what a text says is meant as the goal. So we've talked about this before, but this is where the rubber meets the road. If we know what a text means, it does not necessarily benefit us. It's only whenever, according to James, when you look at it and you do what it says, that it actually can be useful and helpful to training in righteousness. Okay, but be careful in kind of dealing with skepticism that you don't make the goal to just prove that it happened. Sure, it happened, but it happened for a reason. Okay, so another one that's important for us is that people feel that they should approach the Bible in an unbiased way. So scholars are kind of saying, you know, those Christians, we can't trust them for reading the Scriptures or kind of telling us what they mean because they're far too biased about what they say. And I would just point out, and by far not the first to say this, in historical methodologies, this is well established in all higher education. Everyone in higher education has to deal with historical methodology, especially the debates that have happened on it. I would just point out that to approach a text, to deem it worthy of being approached and studying it, is to, by definition, make a biased judgment about what is worth studying. And you cannot pick up a text and judge it to be worth your time in an unbiased way. I mean, the very fact that you are reading the scriptures means that you expect to get something that is worthy of your time from it, and which is quite the bias. And so I would just say that an unbiased approach in history is impossible in every capacity. And by that I simply mean that no one can pick up the Bible and not have their own personality and experience and what they have been taught impact how they read it. And just a quick note, in fact, to educate is actually to extract false information, at least in a literal linguistic way. That's what the word educate means. It's to actually take out false information. And so when we're approaching scriptures, the goal is to not be unbiased, but to actually allow it to change the way that we approach scripture. Okay, and from an apologetics standpoint, I think this is worth sharing, is that people in a younger age are quietly deciding to leave the faith. The Catholic Church just this year, or last year, 2021, released and did a survey, and they found that the average age of the people who were leaving their church, who grew up in it, the average age of them who decided to leave was 13. And they kind of kept it quiet, but they decided to leave by 13, and they really left by the time they were in college. And the data is coming out now more and more, from what I have seen, that it is people leaving after they're leaving home. They're leaving the church kind of more after they're leaving home, but it's stemming from a lot of the experiences and unanswered questions and skepticism and doubts that they had when they were in junior high and high school. And it's not that having doubts will make you leave the faith, but having doubts and letting them marinate in there and kind of letting them simmer, and quite frankly, when you're asking hard questions and no one in the church is willing to give you a straight answer, the data is showing that a lot of people are leaving as a direct result of that. And people are looking for this sense of assurance that as we saw in the First and Second Great Awakening, similar to those, people now are looking for this sense of assurance that their faith is real. So they're looking for some type of experience. And the answer for that, I mean, you can study all you want, and you can get into text and historical documents, but the hard truth of it is that, Jesus did perform miracles, and he did perform those things, and most of the time when people saw him perform miracles, they just gave some sort of, if they had a negative response, they gave some sort of excuse why he could do that. And he could perform miracles right in front of them. He could even rise from the dead, and in that very city call the Jews out, and that's what he did through his apostles. But no miracle was good enough for the Jews. And I think it would be quite inaccurate to say that that everyone can just study their way into the faith. And it does break down a lot of walls for a lot of people, and is very powerful in helping persuasion and conversion. But what I'm wanting you to see from this is people are after the same type of assurance that we've been after for hundreds of years, that Christ is real and that we really are on our way to heaven. And all of this is kind of recycling in the history right now. Okay, moving on to megachurches. There's so much I wish I could say about these, but I'll have to be brief. So there's no official start date. Megachurches, it's not like they kind of started as a got together and said, all right, we're going to start megachurches. There was no official date of megachurches. They kind of have just been growing over the last 40 years exponentially. I mean, remarkably in the last decade especially. I will note that Charles Spurgeon, so This is in London, England. He starts, or at least dedicates and preaches at a church of 6,000 people, and his impact is still prevalent today. You can find Spurgeon everywhere and sermons if you know how to find it. But that's still classified maybe as the first megachurch in modern history. And previous to this, maybe Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, the most beautiful church building ever built. But not many churches held a lot of people, besides Rome and a few other places. But now today, if we're going to kind of see how they have progressed and kind of see it start now and kind of trace our steps backwards, in America there's 1,300 megachurches, roughly a tenth of Protestants who go every Sunday, and they're called Protestants when Pew Research or the Barna Group or whoever is researching these, they don't actually count the Catholic churches that have over 2,000, because they would classify megachurches as a strictly Protestant phenomenon. And I think their data is quite clear on that megachurches is a Protestant phenomenon by and large. They found, so this is all the most recent data that is out there. 70% have more than one campus with the functional headquarters. I'll explain that in a moment. I'll just add, not only do they have more than one campus, but on average, these 1,300 megachurches have about 7.6 services between all of their campuses each Sunday, whether that be online or Saturday night or 3 on Sunday morning. So they're averaging 7.6 across their campuses, so which is quite remarkable. So it's no longer, because of technology and because of this idea of growing campuses while remaining in a non-denomination or a denomination, you can have several services, multiple services across cities, all being part of the same church. And what I would say is this sort of replaces this, this modern approach is replacing this idea of denomination. So, just for example, a few years ago, I went and I spoke with a man by the name of John Weiss. He's a minister at a church of 10,000 people, and what's this, Lexington, Kentucky? I forget. I think it's Southland Christian Church, the church that I went and spoke to him with. And their church, they start several different churches in different cities across different areas, and they would all still sort of be ran by the elders at Southland at their main campus, but they would still not classify themselves as a denomination, even though they had several different groups everywhere. And part of what's happening in the megachurch phenomenon is, not all of them, but a lot of them, 70%, are starting campuses, and this is becoming the norm. I'm wanting us to hear this, that if a church grows exponentially quickly, the normal thing to do, and I think this is a recent development, is to start another church that's under the authority of our present church. Now, that's not always the case, but that is becoming the norm quite rapidly, and I think the data confirms that. And just another shift that's happening. So Lifeway recently came out with this stat, and this is a pre-COVID stat, and we'll next week we'll talk about the implications of what COVID has done to the church moving forward. But for every 3 churches that are closing, 2 are starting. In other words, it's like the amount of church buildings are steadily declining. I think the exact number, it's difficult to count because it depends how you count it, but as many as 8 churches are closing a week, and closing the doors completely and just selling the building in America, and then 2 are starting for every 3. So it's not as if just 3 are going away and others aren't starting. But this is the shift of going from smaller churches to bigger churches. And COVID, I think, has some further things to say about that, and we'll look at that next week. Okay, moving on to kind of another layer of what's going on in recent history of the church. I start with this data. This is from the Gallup. They produce phenomenal research and data, hard data, that weird people like me like to look up and kind of see trends and see what they're saying about the trends, because it's quite fascinating. So this is America's self-identification. I share this in hopes that we can kind of approach this just seeing the phenomenon that's taking place and kind of address, okay, what is happening in America and with the LGBT community at large. And what's one thing that's quite apparent is the percentage of people who are identifying as LGBTQ++, all the letters that are being added now. What's happening is more and more people are in private settings, identifying as it. So if you were to survey people anonymously in 2012, and you ask this question, do you personally identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender? The number would be 3.5%. But if you did the same stat later, so this is 2020, and it's even gone up in the last 2 years, it's as high as 6.4% now. But as of 2020, 5.6%. This might not seem like a large jump, but I mean, we're talking from 3.5 to 5.6. Or to say it another way, roughly a 40% jump in people claiming to be a part of those communities and identifying in that way. And so that those numbers are significant for a number of reasons. Okay, one other quick thing to note here is why those numbers are shifting the way that they are. Why those numbers are shifting the way that they are. They're going from older generations who are closer to the 3.5 range to millennials and Generation Z just absolutely booming up. And so the closer and closer you get to being born in the modern day, the younger you are, in other words, the more likely you are to be LGBTQ. To such an extent that Generation Z is only 78%, basically 79% heterosexual and straight. So the numbers are climbing. That's just the trend that's going on. That's just the data behind this. And there's really no reason to suggest, at least so far, that these numbers are going to slow down or not increase even more. So an interesting stat, just to say it plainly. Okay, I'm going to give you just some brief history on where America's been on this. You may not be familiar with this. Some of this you might be familiar with, and that's perfectly fine. But this is sort of a brief history of really the sexual revolution that's happened in America, and particularly with LGBTQ. I'm focusing on that right now. So the Stonewall riots of 1969. So in New York, as things often were, this particular bar where some people were being arrested by police, specifically gays and bisexuals and transgender, were being arrested, and this bar was ran by the mafia at the time, and it just caused a whole bunch of violence, and it sparked and it gave fuel to kind of a reason to have a unified movement. So if you, depending on the books you read, if someone's looking at when did the LGBTQ community, at least in its modern sense, began, well, there's always been homosexuals in America and on various levels. But as a movement in the modern era, I think it's fair to say that around this time is when they sort of began. So immediately following this, there's lots of organizations that formed as a response, and there were some before. Don't get me wrong, there were some before, but this was really the kind of a post sign on the road, if you want to put it that way, of when it's really picking up a lot of steam. And only a few years later, under a great deal of pressure, the American Psychiatric Association, they declassified homosexuality as a mental disorder. So, under pressure, and I think that it's very well documented that that's the case, under pressure, they're declassifying it that way because of an organized push for people to not associate it with mental illness. But up to this point, it had been classified that way, and in some cases been seen something as to be treated in the American social structure. By 1988, another pivotal moment in history here. So 200 of these members, specifically kind of prevalent leaders across the country, they met together in what they would call a war conference. And you can find this document quite easily and give it a read. You ought to, if you want to see how in 1988 the LGBTQ community, at least 200 of its most prominent spokesmen across the nation, they outlined a plan for what they were wanting to do in the coming years. They openly said they don't represent everybody, so don't, but they did represent a great many. And quite honestly, everything that they mentioned that they wanted to do, they've accomplished since then. And some of the biggest things that they've said, just to highlight a few, so they established a national day of coming out, make it a public holiday, make it a day that it becomes more and more okay. They plan to pressure media and politicians. Literally, the document would say that you should pay for advertisements promoting this sort of lifestyle as normal. You should call all forms of your government and share your opinion with them, adding pressure so that media response is more positive to homosexuality in general. And I think by and large they've been successful about that. By 1993, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell is established, so you can't be openly gay and serve in the military. But the shift that happened in the last few decades is remarkable. We go from that to 2015, the Supreme Court ruling gay marriage is acceptable across the board. So that's the shift that's happened, and make that what you will, but I think it's fair to say that what has happened in the last several decades around sexual identity especially has become one of the key defining issues of this era of the church and how to interact with people. So I want to talk about some implications of this. So this is the shift. So the U.S. of adults who favor and oppose same-sex marriage, basically it flops. It flips. Those who were opposed basically traded places in terms of numbers with those who were in favor. And these are just such recent data too. So it's such a modern shift that's happening right before our eyes. And I'm wanting us to see how recent this development has become. Okay, so these are the impacts. This is from Pew Research. That's what PR means, and This was data from 2015. So, a couple years old. It's essentially not changed much from other data that I could find, but this is a quote that they came out with. So that's why it's in quotation marks. About 4 in 10 of those who attend religious services in the last week, so 39%, favor same-sex marriage, compared with 66 who attend once or twice a month or a few times a year, and 3/4 who say they seldom or never attend. In other words, there's a direct correlation between how often people are attending church and how open they are and for same-sex marriage they are. And not that if you go once a week you're going to be against it, because almost 40% are for it still. And this shift is just drastic from a few decades ago, where the number was closer to under 10%. So this is just completely different, and this is the current state of the church and their approach to homosexuality. Now, they surveyed, in this survey in particular, 34 different denominations representing 60% of Protestants in America. So it's not as if this is just a small group of people and an unfair group. It's including the conservatives in these stats, by and large. So many denominations, I'm just kind of moving on, officially allowing gay marriage, with other approaches often views as homophobic. PCUSA, for example, in the last decade, and I believe it was in 2012, they allowed homosexuals to be married and wed in a Presbyterian church. And the shift in that was quite rapid, and they actually lost 15% of their congregations to people who disagreed. And what's interesting is those who are taking hard stances on this, making official documents, even if you're for it or against it, you'll have churches that will leave you, congregations that will leave you. And it's a tense time to be high up in a denomination wrestling with that, because you are going to have to wrestle with that, and you're going to have pressure to take one stance or the other. And you're going to have to decide essentially where you land on that position. And people are going to ask you, especially now that you're going through Bible college for whatever reason, whether you're going to be a minister or not, people are going to ask you how this increasingly popular and prevalent idea impacts the church. So I'm just wanting you to see the stats on this, because the numbers would say that even within a few more years, if we add 1% every 2 years of people who are coming out this way, then we're essentially adding 4 million Americans who identify as this every 2 years. And that's not going to slow down unless something else happens. Okay, so social implications of faith. This is, I'm phrasing this in a very particular way, so I just want to read this. So social implications of the faith have become both the target and often the starting point in reaching skeptics. What I mean is that issues like this have become both why especially conservative Christians are attacked, but also being able to open up the door for real discussion about why stances are taken the way that they are. Just for example, 2 years ago, sitting in my living room with a couple and their kid, and my wife and I were explaining why we take a very traditional view to marriage, that it's between a man and a woman, and we looked at the scriptures that describe it that way, and the prohibitions against homosexual marriage in Scripture. And when we were asked about that, that kind of opened up the field for actually a reason to talk about Christ, talk about the resurrection, talk about this new life, and his brother who had a boyfriend that he actually brought to our church. And he just wanted to know, hey, would this person be allowed to come in at the church? And of course he would. He'd be allowed to come in and listen and engage with everyone who's there and participate in the service. That wasn't ever in the question. But because we were able to openly talk about the stance that our church took, it opened up the door actually for a good deal of evangelism, to the point where I was able to have conversations about Christ with him because this question got brought up. So, I mean, it has big implications for today. And once you all figure this out, let me know, and I'll happily take the easy answer on how to help the church in the situation deal with all of the social questions that are being thrown at us. Okay. Finally, I got this mental exercise for us here. Okay, so I want us to reflect for a moment on you're in the South during the Civil War, and you're debating abolitionists about blacks and how it's your right to own slaves. And I want to just survey some of the answers, very common answers of why you could own slaves. And this is I mean, well documented in the literature and the debates that were happening. Most commonly, and these are some of the most common reasons for owning slaves that people gave. They would say that they're my property, and you don't have a right to come into our land. It's not yours. This is our property, and therefore you don't have the right to impose that on our property. One of the most common arguments, believe it or not, as inhumane as this sounds, because it is that they said the economic impact on freeing the slaves would be terrible. Guess what? It was. The South suffered greatly when people were freed. So one of the common arguments also was that blacks are not fully human. So they had their whole rule about them being 3/5 of a human. Blacks had no legal standing. I mean, the Supreme Court said that. So you had a lot of people advocating that can own blacks because they don't have any legal right to, and so there's no legal restrictions. It's perfectly legal to own slaves. And that was their one of their arguments. And just finally, that it's actually the best thing for the slave owner. Some of the propaganda around owning slaves was how wealthy it made you and how successful in your life and career it helped you be. Okay, why do I say all that now? We're not talking about the 19th century anymore. Well, now we get to this point. Those who do not know the past are doomed to repeat it. So I want to go back through these, and I want to find out, can we replace a word or so just a few words in each statement, basically change the topic but keep the argument in each of these and make them a modern pro-choice argument. And I don't mean this as a trap. I just mean to say that the arguments that are being made for pro-choice are identical entirely. And I don't mean this as a straw man. I mean this as a very real statement and recognition that what is happening for the lives of the unborn is the same way of dehumanizing that took place for the blacks in the South. That is, in many ways, what I hoped we see and learn from history should be taken as a warning to not repeat the same mistakes. So, going back through these, they're my property, or you might say, this is my body. The economic impact of freeing the slaves would be terrible. Who's going to take care of the babies if they're allowed to live? Look at the costs. I mean, these are real arguments that are being made. They're not fully human. They're just a clump of cells. The unborn have no legal standing. and it's the best thing for the mother. And I don't want to sound sensitive. The stats show that 1 in 4, or as high as 1 in 3 women have had an abortion. So it's highly likely that people in our class and many people close to you have had an abortion. And I think the wrong way of approaching something like this is to simply bash someone and not help them grieve the loss of that human and recover emotionally and physically and mentally and spiritually from all the trauma that takes place from it. But over the last 50 years, as the church has fought for the right for life, and the Catholics have probably done the best job of fighting for it, over the last 50 years, as 60 million Americans of my generation and your generation have been killed, we're looking at sort of a repeat of history of dehumanizing a people group for the sake of benefit, whether that be because the woman is pressured into it by the man, as often is the case, or whatever else it might happen to be. The response of the church now, what I'm hoping we see, is not just to, like the church did after civil wars, is to help slave owners in different ways that kind of were suffering and needed spiritual guidance to sort of show why blacks were human. I really think part of what the church ought to be doing is showing why the unborn are human and bear the image of God. And I'll mention this as well. One of the modern approaches that has been very successful, and one of the things that's very near and dear to my heart for numerous reasons, is churches who are starting entire organizations and movements and retreats for women who've been through abortions. When you talk about this sort of thing, not in a class setting, but more in a church setting or in a setting with lots of people, and be careful, because you're talking to people who've had them. And it's a tragic thing. One of the things that Mother Teresa said regarding abortions, and it's really stuck in my head ever since I first heard this, she said that 3/4 of abortion victims are women. That half of the babies, so you have half the babies, and all of the mothers. It's tragic what's happening, and I think with the Supreme Court possibly ruling on this in the summer of 2020 to discuss Roe v. Wade, I think it's really important that the church prepare for this sort of discussion to come up prevalent and at the forefront, and that we have a response that is both caring towards the mothers who've been through it, but also defending the right and the recognition of humanity. Because when you look back at history, it's much easier to say, oh, these are just garbage arguments. But when you replace them with modern problems, it can become much more of a difficult thing for many people. And to win people over, I think, ultimately, to save lives, is to help people see the humanity of what God has made. So now that we've talked about nothing controversial in any capacity, I'm gonna call it a week for this lecture. Sensitive topics, I know. Feel free to respectfully talk about these in the forums, or to reach out and ask questions. I'd love to hear some dialogue about some of this stuff. There's a lot of stuff that Noel talks about, but not in the kind of the detail that we've been able to in this class. And so next week we'll look at kind of the state of the church today, And particularly in view of COVID, I have some data to share in regards to what that will look like for the future of the church. All right. Hope you all have a great week.